Our next speaker is Stella Christie. Stella Christie is a native of Indonesia. She received her bachelor's from Harvard University and PhD from Northwestern University. After getting tenure at Swarthmore College in 2018, Stella made the bold move of relocating to China. She is now research chair at Tsinghua Laboratory of Brain and Intelligence and an associate professor at the Department of Psychology in Tsinghua University. Stella researches how humans and other animals acquire relational knowledge. Her work on comparison learning received the 2010 Best Paper Award from the Journal of Cognition and Development. In 2016, she was nominated for the James McDonnell Understanding Human Cognition Award. Having lived in 6 countries on all hemispheres, Stella holds a special interest in how relational reasoning is influenced by and influences language, culture, and social interactions. Today, she's going to tell us whether rule learning is like analogy. Stella, if you're ready, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. Hi everyone, it's really nice to see you, even though I can't really see you all, but hopefully later. It's 1:30 a.m. in Beijing right now, so pardon me if I'm a little dozy. We cannot find a good time that can accommodate US and Europe participants, so in the end I decided to just keep the timing, and so it's almost 2 in the morning, but I'm really excited to share with you today a new line of my work, whether is rule learning like analogy. So thank you very much to Margarita and Matt for inviting me and for organizing this conference, this online conference. It's been very nice to hear the analogy talks. So. It's a truth universally acknowledged that the world presents to us with a rich amount of information. And our job as learners is to solve this information problem. We need to think about which information we want to use, either explicitly or implicitly, what information we want to store, what we want to attend to, and what we want to process. So for example, you may be walking into the Galapagos Islands and you come across these beautiful birds, okay? And you can take this as information. And if you are like me, Stella, you might be noticing that the birds are of same colors. They're black birds and there are also brown birds, and that's about it. You notice object similarity, or I notice object similarity, so Stella notices object similarity, and that's the kind of information that leaps to me. However, if you are Darwin and you walk to the same Galapagos Island, okay, and you actually look at these birds, you may be thinking some about the colors of the birds as well. But not only that, you also think about the structure that connects all these birds, and you think about the adaptive radiation structure, and you come up with the most powerful idea in the history. That's the natural selection hypothesis, right? So the same information, but you can see it in different way, whether you're Stella or you're Darwin. And when you hear about this, you get this gnawing feeling that probably is accurate. That it seems that when we think about these information problems, structure versus object, one of them is more difficult. And you probably share my intuition that perceiving structure is difficult. So is perceiving structure difficult? So let's just ask, why do we have this feeling that perceiving structure is difficult? Well, first of all, it took Darwin to identify the structure of natural selection. That's pretty clear. There's only one Darwin who identified the structure of natural selection, even though Stellas of this world have seen the same finches in the Galapagos Island. Okay? Bringing it closer to our home, if adults are not very good at spontaneous solving problems using previously given structure, so it's a classic study by Jake and Holyoke that shows when adults have to solve problems using analogical mapping, when they're not given hint to do so, they were not very good at it. Another classic study from analogy that shows that where structure is difficult is obviously Markman and Gentner 1993, where in a scene analogy mapping task, the adults made analogical mappings at only about 40% in a one-shot mapping task. So when they're not given tools like comparison, just a one-shot mapping task, they did so correctly only at about 40%. These are just two classic analogy examples that I brought up here. There are many other studies, obviously. The third kind of example from analogy that makes us agree that perceiving structure is difficult comes from development of analogical reasoning. Children have difficulties in perceiving common structure. This is well known and very robust in development of analogy. So for example, 4-year-olds, when they are given these triads and asked which of the two bottom pictures match to the top picture, instead of mapping the two circles to the two squares, so mapping the relational commonality, 98% of the time, the 4-year-olds actually map the square with the square. So they map the object instead. So perceiving structure is seemingly very difficult on the one hand. On the other hand, perceiving structure seems to be very easy. 7-month-olds can abstract structure from a mere 2 minutes presentation of syllables. So when 7-month-olds are given familiarization containing sentences like gi la la, na ti ti, li ka ka, that as you notice there is a structure here, there is a rule, that's the ABB, first unit, first variable, second and third variable repeated. They can, after just 2 minutes listening to this, and then given a test of completely new syllables, they never heard the wo and never heard the de, that of either consistent pattern, ABB, or inconsistent pattern, ABA, infants can discriminate between these two patterns. And because there's nothing that's connecting the familiarization and the task in terms of the syllables, then they must have done so because the 7-month-olds can abstract the structure very easily. This finding of rule learning or rule generalization is very robust among infants across many different kinds of items, and even as early as 3 months old. There's a lot of studies that has been done since the seminal study of Marcus 1999. Adults can also abstract rules, although with some limitations, as I will discuss later. And rats can abstract, even rats can abstract the same identical ABB or ABA rule. Okay. So there seems to be a paradox here. On the one hand, structure seems to be difficult, and the other hand, perceiving structure seems to be not difficult. So how do we resolve this seeming paradox? And that's exactly the heart of what propels me into understanding this new line of work. So is it a mere difference of paradigm that analogy studies use one paradigm, rule learning studies use another, or do the cognitive mechanisms differ? Is rule abstraction different from analogical abstraction, even though in the outcome it seems very similar, right? So in order to approach this question logically, we do actually need to look at the paradigm. And when we look at the paradigm, we realize that in many analogical studies, learners can actually choose between structural commonality and object matches. Not in all analogy studies, but in many analogy studies. In other words, in analogy tests or analogy studies, the world is like you can either be Darwin or you can be like Stella. Okay? So it's a world where you can be either Darwin or Stella. So for example, in the Markman-Gentner 1998, in the scene analogy test, you can either think that the woman on the top picture is like the woman at the bottom picture. So this is object similarity. Or you can think that the woman or the receiver woman at the top picture is like squirrel, the receiver of the food at the bottom picture. So that's mapping the structure, or as we know, relational commonality. Also, same thing with the kids study that I have shown you before. You can either choose between the structural commonality or the object matches. In rule learning paradigms, this is not the case. In all rule learning studies, learners need to only discover the rule. In other words, the world of the rule learning test or the rule learning paradigm is either you can be Darwin or nobody. Yeah. So there's no room for Stella in this world. So there's only Darwin or nobody. So for example, as you can see, the classic 7-month-old study, there is no correspondences of item between the familiarization and the test. This is true in all rule learning study, as I said. So here's another example using shapes. You can see that the familiarization items on the left, there's nothing that in the test items that correspond to the familiarization item. This is, of course, by design. The test items are novel items. So in the seminal work, to understand whether human infants can abstract a structure, it's necessary that the tests are actually novel items. In other words, the structure or the rule is the only viable information that the learners can discover during tests. But we know that the world never presents only structural information. And that is what I want to pursue today. And that is, when both structure and object information are available, which information do learners use? To be more specific, we want to ask whether rule learning, like analogy, is constrained by object matches. Preliminary answer seems to suggest that yes. As far as I know, there are no studies that directly look into this question, but there's a preliminary, there's a study by, a very nice study by Sven, Dedry, and Ken, where they modeled the infant rule learning using simulations using structure mapping engine. And SME successfully modeled the infant rule learning, and this was without pre-training, and the data was also noisy. There's a lot of interesting result that comes out of that paper. Highly encourage you to read that paper. One thing that I found really interesting is that the rule abstraction, when you look at the end of it, after SME actually successfully abstracted it, is not truly an algebraic rule as Marcus imagined it. In fact, there's object information in the rule, in the abstraction of the rule. That's why I put the rule in inverted quotation. So these at least suggest that the objects does play a role, just like in analogical processing, even when we get to the abstraction of relational commonality. Okay. So what we wanted to do is to directly look at this question. Our experimental logic is very simple. We want to test rule learning in a world containing structure and object. So we use the rule learning paradigm, exactly the same rule learning paradigm as in the Marcus 1999, but with an analogical twist, which is that we inserted object matches at tests. All data that I'm presenting to you today are from adults. This is the first time in my life that I ever presented a talk that doesn't contain developmental data. So I guess thanks to the pandemic. So all data are from adults, although we do plan to run this with kids later. So here is the so the adults have to solve information problem, meaning they have to choose, they have to make use of a type of information, or to choose between two types of information. So here's the task for the adults. It's a bit simplistic because we wanted to use this exact same task with kids later. Imagine that you're walking in a forest and you encounter Bella, a baby bunny who has lost her family. Your goal is to help Bella the bunny find her family. You can help her because every family of bunnies has its own song. And we play the family song. This is the familiarization task. So just like the familiarization for the 7-month-old infants, we use identical stimuli as the Marcus et al. Half of the people hear ABA pattern, and the other half heard ABB pattern. It's exactly 2 minutes, 16 sentences of 3-syllable strings. It sounds like this.
Ga, la, ga. Li, ti, li. Ni, la, ni.
Okay. So after they heard this for 2 minutes, then they were asked which one is Bella's sister or Bella's mom or all other family members for the eight test trials. Okay. So we ran 2 conditions between subjects. In the control condition, so that's the rule only condition, that's a replication of the exact replication of the rule learning study. So they heard in a test, they heard either a rabbit that sings
whoa, duh, whoa,
which is the rule match, the correct rule match, or
whoa,
a non-rule match.
Duh.
Okay. So they have to choose between this. They collect which one is Bella's sister. In the critical condition that we're interested in is the object match condition. We contrasted the rule and the object. So one rabbit again,
whoa, whoa,
sing the wo, and the other rabbit,
whoa, la.
La is a syllable that they heard before from familiarization. We use a small subset of the familiarization, exactly 2 out of 8 syllables in the object match condition during tests. So they have to choose between these two. What did we find? In the control condition, or the rule-only condition, we found that adults had no problem whatsoever in abstracting the rule. So this was not very surprising, but also very reassuring. So there's nothing odd or funny about about the story or about our stimuli. Without when there is only rule to be discovered, adults have no problem to discover the rule. You do notice probably that it's not at 100%, but it's way above chance. Okay. Now, what happened when there were in the world where there is both structure and object information? This is what happened. I plotted on the y-axis percentage of rule matches. So that means when the bar is low, that is, as in the case of the rule versus object, the adults are actually choosing not the rule. They are also not choosing not a chance, but in fact, they chose the object very strongly. The adults actually chose this more than like 80% of the time. The adults preferred objects. Frankly, we were quite surprised when we found this. We thought that the objects will make some impact or effect on the processing of these stimuli and then the generalization, but we didn't expect it to be this strong. So then we look at the individual data. So that was the percentage, the average of choosing either rule or object. What about the individual data? So we classify participants as either rule chooser, so they have to choose the rule match on at least 7 ROF trials, or opposite chooser. Opposite chooser means that in the control condition, we just call it opposite chooser because they chose something else. There's only rule in the control condition. But opposite chooser in the object match condition means that you are object matcher, right? You choose the object, or you don't choose the rule for most of the trials. So in the control condition, you see that quite a large number of the people were rule choosers. There's also some mixed choosers. And that's why it's not 100% the average of choosing rule. But see what happened in the object match condition. You see that the green bar decreased significantly, the red bar increased significantly. That means majority of the individual consistently chose the object matches. So most of the people actually were opposite choosers, which is again very surprising. Adults, like infants, are able to abstract simple rules. There's no surprises there, but it's a good reassuring that our stimuli and our paradigm actually works. However, surprisingly, in the presence of object match, adults do not make the rule-based generalization. And we wanted to ask whether this pattern of information processing, meaning that you were disrupted or even strongly preferring the object match, generalized across domains. As some of you may be familiar with, in the literature of rule learning, there has been a lot of attempts to understand whether rule abstraction is domain general. And by and large, by now, I think we got the answer that the answer is yes. So we wanted to see a similar phenomenon, not only with the rule-based generalization, but with the pattern that rule-based generalization is constrained by object matches. So in the next study, we did the same thing, but identical to experiment 1, but using shape. So now your goal is to lead Bella home safely. It's again Bella. You can help her because there are signs in the forest that indicate a safe path. In order to make this as equivalent to the sound condition as possible, during familiarization, we play the sign one by one. So the shape appears one by one, just like when you hear ga, li, ga. So in fact, the timing is identical between the syllables utterance and the shape utterance. So everything else is identical except that it's shape or syllables. So just like before, we ran two conditions between subjects. Either you were in the control, you can only you have to only discover the rule or something else that's not relevant. Or in the object match condition, you can choose between the rule and the object match. Also, like before, we only use 2 out of 8 shapes in the object match. And so a very small subset. So it's a minimal, you can think about it as a minimal object match. And I'll talk about later why we did like in the minimal way. In the control, we replicated, so no problem. The adults could abstract the rule when there was only a rule to be discovered. But in the object match condition, we also replicated. Now the adults were at chance. We replicated in the sense that, again, their rule-based generalization was disrupted. However, there is a there is a domain condition. So if we compare the syllables and the shape, the red bars do not differ from each other. The blue bars do differ from each other. So in the object match versus rule condition, in fact, the syllables actually make adults more likely to forego the rule and choose the object matches. And this is a little surprising, but we also find this to be the case in the individual data. So if you look at just the focus on the red bar from the object match, these are opposite chooser, or in other words, object chooser. You can see 75% were object chooser in the syllables and 34% were object chooser in the shape. So we did find that domain differences. Why does adult find object matches even more salient in syllables than in shape? I said that this is a little surprising because, in fact, the finding from the rule learning literature actually suggests that syllables are better for rule abstraction. So infants have been tested, for example, with tones. And sometimes this is actually difficult to abstract rule from tones. But if they learn, if they're in the familiarization, they hear syllables first, then they can actually abstract the tones. So in this case, we found that the syllables the adults are of course okay, their performance are at ceiling when it's rule only, but at the same time, when they are given both rule and object, the syllables were actually more disruptive, or the object matches became more salient in the syllables than in shape. So there are a number of possible hypotheses, but one thing that we're entertaining right now, ongoing studies in the lab right now, is to think that maybe the syllables are more meaningful. So as a unit, it's more meaningful than the shape. So that's why you pay more attention to the object match. It could also be at the same time that it helps you to do rule abstraction, but also to make you more likely to do the object match. Now, for those of you astute analogical researchers, you right away notice that there is a tantalizing similarity in this. In that this sounds really similar to analogical findings where children are more likely to be object matchers when they are given rich object versus when they're given simple objects. A classic finding by Ratherman and Gentner in 1991. I put a question mark there because I'm not sure at the moment if it's really the same kind of thing. So meaningful, rich object, but we're currently looking into this in my lab. So the next study, what I wanted to know is whether these findings universal. So we did a cross-cultural study. So recent review suggests that East Asian children are more relational than their Western peers. So I just published a work reviewing all the development of analogical reasoning from East Asia and Western, and there is a clear pattern that East Asian children are more relational than their Western peers. There's also a lot of suggestions, although no hard evidence from work in the tradition of Nisbat East-West differences that Easterners are more relational. I mean, Eastern adults. So there's that suggestions in the writings, even though there's no actual studies that shows that. But so I wanted to know whether these actually hold, or whether there's actually differences across US and China participants. So we conducted the whole experiment 1 and whole experiment 2 with identical materials and procedures with Chinese participants in mainland China. And just to tell you really briefly, because of time, we replicated all the findings of E1 and E2. So we found no cultural differences, okay? No cultural differences whatsoever. So here's the quick comparison between US and China data. You did notice that the Chinese subjects in the control conditions did extremely well, but these red bars are not significant at the moment. But they did extremely well in terms of just discovering the rule. However, when it comes to rule versus object match, both participants were equally likely to choose the object match. That's from the syllables. And then when we get to the shapes, experiment 2, we got very, very similar pattern again. And in the China data, we again found syllables and shapes domain differences when we compare the object match versus rule condition. Okay. But the take-home finding about this is that we don't have any cultural differences in adults. In the next series of studies, this is the last one that I'm going to present today, is I wanted to ask whether I'm really curious about the representations that form during learning and the retrieval or the usage of it, so to speak, during generalization or during tests. So what I want to know is whether the learners can flexibly switch between structure and object. On the one hand, we saw very, very clearly that when the world contains only rule, adults have no difficulties to abstract the rule. On the other hand, we also see that when the world contains both rule and object, it's very easy for the adults actually forgo the rule and go for the object instead. So what we wanted to find out is whether they can switch back and forth between these very quickly. To put it very simply, I want to know whether Stella can become Darwin in a spur of a moment, okay? And I think when I put the question, and so this is a very exciting question for me, right? Can I become Darwin immediately? Can I see those structures immediately? So in order to ask that question, we did exact same familiarization with experiment 1. So we played the syllables. And at the test phase, the one modification that we did is instead of all 8 trials between subject, only object match or only control, here within subject, we first play the object match block. So they had the options to choose between rule match and object match. And then after that, right away, no delay, in the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th test trials, they go to the control block when the only thing that they have to discover is the rule representation. In other words, if the rule was learned, which we think that it should be during the familiarization, then can they easily go back to the rule even after they actually went back, after they actually chose the object in the first block? The easiest way to see the outcome of this experiment is by actually looking at the pattern of the individual choosing. So here it is. On the left, what I did is basically, this is out of 100 subjects, so 67, meaning 67 out of 100 subjects are object choosers. So you can think of it as percentage. Block 1, object match. Majority of people were object choosers. That's not surprising. This is what we expected. Our question is, what happened to these object choosers in block 2? And remember, in block 2, the only thing that you can discover is the rule. So there's no more object right here. You can either choose the rule or you can be at chance. Now, really surprisingly, as you can, and so what I plotted here is the flow, right? So from block 1 to block 2. And I'm just going to highlight that very small percentage of the object choosers became rule choosers, even though that's the only thing that you can discover. That's the only thing that you can solve the problem. Majority of the object choosers, 76% of the object choosers actually were lost. They become what we call mixed choosers, meaning that they actually just stay choosing at random, even though they could, of course, just go for the rule now. There's no more competition between the rule and the object. So the take-home message of this is that no, Stella cannot become Darwin in the spur of the moment, and which is not the very good news for me. Okay. So once you choose the object matches, it's very difficult to switch the rule, even when there were no object matches to be discovered. And notice that this is only out of 4 trials. 4 trials is enough to make you being rather fixated about this. In the last study that I want to present to you, we asked the other way around. So can Darwin become Stella? Okay, is like are Darwins of this world also can easily go for object matches and forgo the structure. So what we did is simply switch the test phase. So it started with the control block. The only thing that you can answer is the rule. Okay, and after that you get the opportunity to choose between the rule and the object. When we did this, we see there's like 46% of rule choosers. This is the average percentage of rule choosing is not different from experiment 1. Neither is the individual pattern. So we're looking at the individual pattern right now. So 46% are rule choosers, and rule choosers in this case, by the way, it's like choosing 4 out of 4 because there are only 4. So it's a very stringent criteria. So for the rule choosers, of course, actually, there's not much temptation to become object choosers. In fact, 76% of the rule choosers stays to be rule choosers, and only 9% of them switch to object, right? So this is different from the experiment 1 when they were not preceded by answering the rule. So when they right away were giving rule and object, majority of the people were choosing the object. But if they already started by this explicitly or implicitly going for the rule, then they actually, most of the time, they stick with the rule. Some people did get confused of the rule chooser, so they there's a 15% of mixed choosers, so from rule to mixed choosers. Okay. So across this series of 4 experiments, to the title of my question, is rule learning like analogy? I think the answer is yes, rule learning is like analogy. When both structural and object matches are available, adults' rule abstraction is constrained by object matches. This is true across domains, syllables, and shapes, stronger in syllables, but nevertheless, this is true for shapes as well. Even across cultures, in US and China participants, we replicated the findings exactly. This is consistent with theories of analogical processing. We know that in analogical processing, while the final outcome of analogical mapping only involves relational commonality, so a relational abstraction, in the actual process of computing an analogy, both object and relational similarities are at work. And as far as I know, this is true whether you are a structure mapping theory fan or you're Lisa fans or you're Dora fans. Both in all theories of analogy, we do consider that the object matches are actually part of the analogical computation. In fact, this is also consistent with some studies in the rule learning literature. So there is, for example, a study by Andres, Scholl, and Meller that shows that rule learning is indeed sensitive to perceptual factors. So they call it the saliency effect. This is with adults. So this is consistent. And what we see across the studies that I presented today is definitely the perceptual factors, the object matches are part of the rule abstraction processing. Okay. Is rule learning like analogy? One answer is also maybe, in the sense that there's a lot of work that we still want to do. For example, one important question is, if rule learning is like analogy, then we should expect tools of analogical learning, like language and comparison, also foster rule abstraction. And here it gives me a pause a little bit when I think about comparison in particular, because there is already an implicit comparison in the familiarization, right? So when they hear gilala, natiti, likaka, that's already an implicit comparison. So why they're still easily fooled by the object matches? And remember that these are adults, sophisticated adults, not like infants, okay? But it's possible that these there's many ways the comparisons are not as alignable as possible. So of course, one question that we are also doing right now in the lab is asking whether progressive alignment helps. So if I give something like gilala, kilala, tilala, so progressive, the similarity, very similar items in the familiarization, does this actually does this actually help or foster the rule abstraction? This opens up very interesting questions because most of the time, I think abstractions of structure or in the rule learning literature only consider variability of the items. And here we're actually making an opposite prediction. It doesn't. We actually want to have similarity because from analogy literature we know that similarity helps. So that's a question that we're pursuing right now. Marrying the paradigm of rule learning and analogical learning has opened a large number of very interesting questions, at least to me. I only want to bring up one today, and that is what I started at the beginning, which is the solving information problem, structure versus object. We know that what I want to ask is which information, structure or object is more predictive or adaptive or beneficial for the learners. In other words, now that we actually see that rule learning is like analogy, common to both rule learning and analogical learning is the problem of why do we sometimes see the structures and why do we sometimes more likely to see the object matches. So this is a question that dominates my thinking right now. And prior work in analogy has shown the effects of the learner's knowledge and executive function on analogical mapping success. But I think it's also very beneficial to start thinking about not only from the learner's side. So if the learner is more knowledgeable, more likely to see the structure, these are obviously very important. But what about the nature of the problem to be solved? In this world, is it always more beneficial to attend to structure more than to object? For physicists solving phase matters, it is. You only look at the structure, you only look at the relation, you don't care about the object. But and in language learning, a lot of the times we kind of presume or assume that that grammar, the structure is very important. But obviously, object matches play a role there as well. In social interaction, I wrote about this in my 2017 paper, whether it's not clear whether is it better for you to remember that Jenny is that mean person, or about the structure of the interaction between Jenny and a lot of people around me. So is it structure or object that's more important in the social interaction, that's more predictive? In wayfinding, in food finding. So is it better for you to remember the landmark or to remember how it's arranged or structurally arranged with other landmarks? Okay, or you have to do. So thinking about the nature of the problem actually brings out quite a number of interesting predictions. For example, we can think about why might we have species differences. So why might one species more likely to pay attention to structures and other species do not? And maybe because that the accumulations of the kinds of problems, the nature of the problems that the species actually face in the environment. So right now we are about to do studies with marmosets. So comparing, because here I actually have access to marmoset lab, comparing infants and marmosets. The last thing that I want to bring up is that, of course, you will all tell me that both structure and object are predictive. Yeah, that's pretty clear. But the question is, what's a good ratio? For example, if we think about the Goldilocks effect, this is a work by Salaskit, that shows that infants already selectively attend to things that neither too complex or too simple. So it has to be just the right kind of complexity. And I think a really intriguing question is, if we think about complexity of information, can this calculation of complexity includes both object and structure? And what does that look like, a new calculation of complexity? In other words, there are many questions that can be answered with this new rule analogy paradigm. With that, I want to thank you for this. We'll be very happy for discussions. I also want to tell you that when things are better, I hope many of you will visit me in China. This is Tsinghua Laboratory of Brain Intelligence is an independent institute. It's an interdisciplinary institute in Tsinghua University. It's a wonderful institute and I hope many of you will visit me. And thank you very much, especially to my student collaborators Particular thanks to Evan Orticio, my former undergraduate student, who did all the heavy lifting and did all these studies. Evan will also be giving this talk at Koksai. Chiu Chun Ma, Ning Wei, Shi Yudong, Xinye Li are the students who did this work in China. All right.